Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 11th of March 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. I nearly slipped up but didn't. And we're going to be joined by live video Skype link by David Scott, Northern Exposure, telling us what's been happening north of the border. Before we start, of course, a brief comment on the weather. It's pretty grey, we understand, in Scotland. It was bright this morning in Plymouth, but it seems to have gone a little bit grey here. And we've only got powder blue skies in one part of the UK. I'm not sure where that was, so mixed bag at the moment. But you're going to cheer us up with finance, Mike, and such matters.
I'm hoping David will say something about this, but this is obviously European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, his announcement of the new monetary policy decisions from yesterday. So interest rates on the main refinancing operations will be decreased by 5 basis points to 0.00%, and that starts on the 16th of March. They've also announced that the interest rate on the marginal lending facility, this is the facility where money can be lent to banks overnight from the European Central Bank, and that's supposed to be against some form of collateral, but of course they don't have any collateral, so it's kind of a scam sort of thing. But anyway, they can borrow money overnight. That has been decreased to 0.25%, and the interest rate on deposits has been decreased to minus 0.4%. And these were all effective from the 16th of March. Then they've increased quantitative easing to 80 billion euros a month. And the other interesting thing is that they have decided that this will include non-bank corporations. So in other words, they're going to use corporate debt, corporate bonds, as well as government bonds. And then finally, they've announced a new series of 4 targeted longer-term refinancing operations, each with a maturity of 4 years. And they're going to be launched in June this year. And the borrowing conditions in these operations will be as low as the interest rate on the deposit facility. So the interest rate on the deposit facility is almost a negative number. Sorry, it's already a negative number because it's minus 0.4%. And so, David, this effectively means that the banks can borrow money for 4 years and pay back less than they borrowed.
Yes. What a world we live in. We have a situation which defies logic. What's the basis of interest rates? It's essentially founded on time preference. Would you rather have £100 now or £100 in a year? And this is now being reversed. Normal human rationality is no longer forming the basis of our financial system. One of the effects of all of this nonsense is going to be a further problem with the intertemporal allocation of resources allocated now or in the future. That's all skewed. That's all muddled now. The allocation of resources between the generations is all skewed. We're seeing the main working part of the population now being poorer than many of the retirees. And essentially, they're still being taxed to subsidise those retirees. We're going to see pensions increasingly in a huge black hole, because what do you need? What sort of return do they need? 7-8% for a pension fund? Well, they're not getting it these days. And all these people who pretend to know what they're doing, this is lunacy, Mike. This is absolute financial vandalism.
Well, unfortunately, I couldn't find an image of Mario Draghi with a helicopter cap on, but maybe somebody could do something with Photoshop later. But he said, "We have shown we are not short on ammunition," and I mean this is nonsense. He went on to say, "We don't anticipate it will be necessary to reduce rates further." So, in other words, he's kind of acknowledging that he's done what he can do. He can't really do any more. It's probably, I mean, he's probably acknowledging that he's already done too much, but nonetheless. What is this about? It's really only about sorting out temporarily the balance sheets of the banks because they're bankrupt. Yeah.
Yes, and don't you love the way that the central banks? Bernanke started this, and now the European central bank's doing the same thing. Don't you love the language they're using? Ammunition. We haven't run out of ammunition. We can bomb the economy some more if we need to.
But we can also magic up money to buy ammunition, which is why he hasn't run out of it, presumably.
Okay, well, look, let's move on. This is the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accounting, and they're talking about council tax. They're saying the council tax is going to rise by an average of 3.1% next year, and that's everywhere, really. That's an average across the country with the exception of London. So London basically aren't going to be seeing any particular council tax rises. They're saying that most councils are going to increase tax by the maximum of 3.99%. That's made up of 2% precept for social care authorities and 1.99% allowed under the government's referendum cap. So the average increase outside the capital 3.6%, but for people that are in band, the example they give, the people that are in band D in London will only have a £10 increase. So perhaps people should be, Brian, writing to Section 151 officers and asking for explanations.
I think this is a very powerful thing to do because, of course, we know that the majority of councils across the country don't even like the real name of those Section 151 officers to come into the public domain. So simply starting to write to them and finding out who they are. And the point is these people are personally responsible for the decisions they're making and the information they give.
Yeah.
Good situation.
The Chartered Institute for Public Finance and Accountancy publishes this website, Public Finance, and they're carrying an article today from Alexandra Jones called Osborne's Budget Must Continue Whitehall's Devolution Drive. And she's saying in last summer's budget speech, George Osborne set out his long-term vision for building a higher wage, lower tax, lower welfare economy in the UK, promising to give Britain a pay rise while also announcing major cuts in welfare spending. It's a theme the Chancellor is likely to return to again in his budget next Wednesday, when he's expected to announce further welfare cuts. And so she goes on and she says that really what he needs to do is to keep devolution deals for economic growth focused on city regions and complete the coverage of our largest cities, reform the business rate system to support economic growth, use devolution to increase the rate of house building in our most successful cities. So, as we reported a week or two ago, the so-called housing crisis is being used to drive the broader breakup of the country. And she finishes by saying the Chancellor has already warned the UK faces a dangerous cocktail of economic risks, including tension in the Middle East, slowing growth in China and lower oil prices, but a budget that builds on devolution deals and the Northern Powerhouse and recognises how to make the most of our city regions would go a long way in ensuring that the UK is in a stronger economic position to withstand the challenges ahead. So the question is, who is Alexandra Jones? Well, here she is on the left there. And she is Chief Executive of Centre for Cities, which is a think tank driving the city's agenda, the city's common purpose, we might say. They are an independent, non-partisan think tank. It's amazing how many of these independent, non-partisan think tanks there are, but they're another one. But in this case, they're dedicated to understanding and improving city economies, and they do this by producing evidence-based research and events exploring key areas that affect UK economy. So what's Alexandra's background? Well, she has worked on strategic projects with organisations ranging from Leeds City Region and the Solent Local Enterprise Partnership to the business-led West End Partnership. She's involved with the City Finance Commission, London Finance Commission, City Growth Commission, and she's a member of the London Stansted Cambridge Corridor Commission, so she's certainly on many commissions.
I wonder what her qualifications are in this area.
That's a very good question. She says that she's also an experienced presenter and commentator for broadcast and print media. She was also at one point working for the Work Foundation, and she was also at one point working as a private secretary to the Permanent Secretary in the Department of Education and Skills.
Wow.
So there you go. So what is the Centre for Cities? Well, they are in fact driving the common purpose, and one of the groups driving the common purpose, here we have them contributing to the Faith Foundation Forum, the Faith Foundation's common purpose event. This is about a year ago on smart cities, and it says here on the 15th of April, the Faiths Forum for London hosted CSC leaders, a renewal of the Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conferences, which is delivered by International Leadership Development Organisation Common Purpose. The session at Collaboration House allowed participants an opportunity to explore what makes London a magnet for talent, culture, opportunity and wealth. Questions included, what first came to your mind when you read the overarching challenge? We'll come on to that in a second. Why is it that London is a magnet city from your perspective? What are the key challenges for London now in terms of cohesion and faith? How can they play a part in London's future success? What are the challenges likely to be in the future? And what role does your institution play in making London a global city? And Andrew Carter, who was the Deputy Chief Executive of Centre for Cities, was contributing to that. And it's all in line with the Common Purpose Challenge, which is asking people to generate ideas to improve their cities, apparently. Once they submit their ideas, they'll go to a panel, and the winners will have a chance to present their ideas to another panel led by David Putnam, and will include Sir Howard Bernstein, Chief Executive of Manchester City Council, the Director of Police from Karnataka in India, a trustee at Bangalore's Little Theatre Foundation, the founder and Chief Executive of the Diane Modal Sports Foundation, Atos Consulting is represented, and Sun Life is represented.
Right.
And these people are going to come together and choose what are the best ideas for developing our cities. So, and they also mentioned, of course, that this may end up being featured in a comic relief film, which will be presented in Bangalore and Manchester.
Well, that's useful, isn't it?
So, what this demonstrates, Brian, is that, Common Purpose is not just a simple leadership training organisation. It is a campaign organisation. They are actively campaigning with their various networks for devolution on a political level. It is what you say they've always been. They are a political charity, and aiming to break up the country through devolution and establishing these city, region, states, feudalism.
En route, we've got to say, devolution, city-states en route to a one-world system of government.
Yeah.
A dangerous political charity.
Do you have any comments, David?
I love the fact that they all meet in Collaboration House. I think that's almost poetic.
Yes.
There's a lot in this. It's tremendously interesting. The co-opting of faith groups into to serve political purposes, to serve centrally set political goals, I think is a very interesting and very dangerous development.
And it's increasing. I think we'll have a discussion on that in some depth at a time in the near future, because it's a fascinating topic. David, let's come over to your report from Scotland, and you've got this tragic event where a young teenage boy was stabbed at a school, Colts Academy, teenager charged with Bailey Gwyn murder. And you've linked this through to some sort of interesting people and organisations. So you were interested in the appointment of this lady to Aberdeen City Council, Gail Gorman. I've got another graphic lined up which will show the sort of network of organisations. But tell us about this stabbing and what the interest in Ms. Gorman is. Yes,
this is a very tragic case. Bailey Gwyn was the young man's name, 16-year-old, 6'2", keen on going down to the gym, wanted to join the Marines, a young man with his life ahead of him. He went to school one day, and he never came home. It would seem pretty infantile argument about a biscuit. It got violent, and he was stabbed. He was stabbed through the heart, and he died. A tragedy, and you have to feel for his family to lose a son under such circumstances. I can only vaguely imagine what they must have gone through. The reason that I highlighted this, or that it came to my attention as maybe signifying something more something wider, was the press coverage or the press conference given by the head of Child Protective Services and Child Services in Aberdeen. She gave this talk to the BBC and the press immediately after the guilty verdict came through on the 16-year-old assailant who carried out this killing. He was convicted of culpable homicide. And it was a very, very odd and creepy and strange presentation to the press, because she talked about both children. She talked about how tragic it was for someone to die as a child, and she talked about the assailant as a child, and this was a matter of two children. She talked about how grateful she was to all the work that had been done by the headmistress and the staff of the school and the pupils, and how that they viewed Bailey as one of us. And she didn't mention the family. The whole way through this press announcement, she didn't mention the family. And it was strange. She mentioned everybody but. So that then raised the question, well, there's something more happening behind the scenes here. Who is this person? So we started to have a little look at her background and some of the organisations she was linked to.
Can I assist here, David? We'll just bring on screen the diagram. We actually had this, I think it was Monday when we initially showed this. We were looking at a very interesting network of interests and organisations around school children, principally in Scotland, but with some links south of the border. So we had the Five Nations Network that was linked into the Council of Europe, the Association for Citizenship Training, Lord Blunkett, Honourable, I need to say there, the Honourable Lord Blunkett connected with that. And down at the bottom, we've got the Gordon Cook Foundation, which is the organisation this lady, Gail Gorman, that you're speaking about, is connected to. And just before I hand you back, I'll continue the links. So we've got Association of Directors of Education in Scotland involved. We've got the McRobert Trust. We've got the Institute for Global Ethics, which I think we'll cover a bit in a minute. We've got another, the Beyond the Comfort Zone. This is a document talking about education. And then this was one of their statements, which said that basically there's a war for children's minds going on. And the last bit of the jigsaw was this lot was linked to the United Nations. So I think this led you to a thing called values education.
Well, it did, yes, and very quickly it led to some very strange places. So this is Gail Gorman, who's Director of Education and Children's Services at Aberdeen Council, and her background is she was from the Department of Education and Cambridgeshire Council, so time-served public sector person in this field. And she's a trustee of the Gordon Cook Foundation. The Gordon Cook Foundation are linked to a huge network, which you've expressed there on that slide, a huge network of non-governmental organisations and governmental organisations and think tanks, and they're all independent, and you can cut the independence with a knife, but they're all going down a particular route, and one of those routes is value education, and they talk explicitly about this and in glowing terms about value education. So what is value education? Well, here's the definition. Values education is an activity during which people are assisted by appropriately qualified adults in schools, homes, clubs, and religious and other youth organisations to make explicit those values underlying their own attitudes, to assess the effectiveness of these values for their own and others' long-term well-being. Remember, we can't define that. And to reflect on and acquire other values which are more effective for short and long-term well-being. So what this is about is changing people's beliefs. This is the state changing how you think, changing what you believe, changing your values. And it's explicitly an attack on Christianity. That definition is from a paper which the author of which goes on to say religious, moral and personal and social education, for example, should be scrapped and replaced by values education. So that's the agenda. We're going to get values education coming in And values education is about changing values. It's about changing the values that our young people gain from their homes, from their parents, and from broader society. The state doesn't like those values. They're to be changed, and the state's approved values are going to be inserted.
David, if I was to say 4 legs good, 2 legs better at this point, that might give us a clue.
Well, what do you mean by that, Mike?
Well, I'm just talking. This was Animal Farm. How the values were changed in Animal Farm as you got towards the end of the book, and so basically, there's nothing set in stone. At whatever the government agenda is at the moment, that's what they present.
Yes, that's a good point, and you're quite right. It's been a little while since I've read Animal Farm, but it's essential reading.
I'll just come in, if I may, very quickly. The next slide we've got here is citizenship and values education. And of course, you'd pointed out quite rightly that this organisation that's connected through to the Gordon Cook Foundation and Global Ethics is being funded by, here we are, Ford's, Kellogg's, David and Lucille Packard Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. So when we talk about government implementing these things, it's a pretty loose definition, isn't it? Because when we look at the funders, actually it's not the government, it's big corporatist interests, albeit tied up in independent foundations.
So much of this comes from the tax exempt foundations that seem to influence and in many regards steer government. You look at some of the things that the government are doing, you think, well, that looks strange, that looks unusual, where did that come from? And you find it's the tax exempt foundations a quarter of a century before or more have been working towards this agenda and patiently introducing it into public life.
Indeed. And what about the tan dance then? Because this was a fascinating one that you'd found linked. Here
Yes.
we are.
The Gordon Cook Foundation immediately, as I was looking at this, they linked down to Tan Dance, which I thought was a strange sounding organisation. What are they all about? And they are an organisation based in the South Wales area, which I associate with the teenage suicide cluster. So that was immediately an area. So, well, what are they doing? And they are teaching joy through dance, it would seem. But the underlying philosophy is a surprising one. The underlying philosophy comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, who is famous for his view that God is dead, that we're going to replace Christianity, which he detested, with various forms of philosophy and culture. And he was extremely nihilistic, and he ultimately had a breakdown, and I think he committed suicide, as I recall. So this seems a very strange nihilistic approach, where there is no such thing as right and wrong, there is no such thing as absolute values. Everything is whatever you want it and argue it to be teaching our young people, and teaching our young people in an area where lack of hope and lack of optimism is resulting in an extremely alarming rate of suicide for people who have their entire lives ahead of them.
So this is indeed a war on children's minds. It seems very interesting that these organisations claiming to be helping children in their education and their development as individuals are describing a war going on. Of course, one very brave lady who has campaigned for years and years about this sort of attack on children is Charlotte Iserby. And I know you were keen to mention her.
Yeah, Charlotte Iserby. This is the reason that I immediately seized on the term values education, because I learned from this woman what that actually meant and the nature of the attack on, in her case, in the American education system. And she's written this book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which details from the Leipzig school onwards through operant conditioning, through training people as though they are animals, training them for a role in an economy, but not having any sort of idea of personal development and self-mastery that the education used to stand for. And she's documented the introduction of that into the United States, and sounded the alarm over all the values ed, death ed, sex ed, etc., and what it really does to our young people.
Yeah. So we've taken a little bit of a diversion away from the original incident of the stabbing. Let's have a look at these
yes, and
newspaper.
coming back to that, so the very strange announcement to the press was the thing that turned me on to this as something that might have other. There might be another story here. So I started to sort of monitor what was coming out of the local press. This is the Press and Journal, which is the Aberdeen local newspaper. It's a very good newspaper. And they're saying, well, who was this person that actually carried out the stabbing? And it transpires that in 2007, this teen attacked another pupil from his primary school with rocks and in a lane near the school to his very serious injury. Now, the mother of that child campaigned very vigorously for something to be done, feeling that this boy was in fact a threat to other children and that it might happen again and there might be more serious consequences. So here you have a loving parent who actually called the problem in 2007. We have a state in Scotland that claims to be essentially all-knowing. Named person scheme, which we'll come into, is all about the state knowing better than individual pupils and families and better than parents. So this concerned parent reported these concerns repeatedly and vigorously to the authorities, and nothing happened. There was no proper investigation. Grampian Police, followed by Police Scotland, did nothing. The school didn't seem to act in any particularly deliberate or definite way, and nothing happened from that. And then we find out that the trial emerged that the killer had previously been spoken to about carrying a knife to school. So there was a known problem here, and again the state officials completely failed to deal with it. Now we can see why the head of Child Services in Aberdeen Council was coming out and talking only about her staff, her head teacher and her pupils, and how they were one big loving family, and ignoring the actual loving family that was involved in the case. The reason she did this is she knows they're culpable. She knows they have let that family down extremely badly, and they are trying to get their ducks in a row to protect themselves from criticism now that things have gone horribly and tragically wrong.
David, this is an increasingly common approach, isn't it? That parents or the general public take the common sense action. They see something wrong, they take the right action, and it's the authorities that then pervert the situation by covering up or lying. Just to move us on a little bit, isn't it interesting that while we've still got plenty of common sense in the public, general public domain, the government is basically saying, well, actually, you are all going a bit doolally. So we've been warning over the last few days about the government's dementia push, and I'm going to bring it back in because this seems to us to be one of the most dangerous things that we've seen in some time. The BBC News here, dementia information for over 40s to be given by GPs. And it comes back to this NHS document, which was kindly provided to us, Enhanced Service Specification. I'm putting it up on screen. You won't be able to read it, but just to show we do know the document and we've got the document. This is the contractual document, which is setting out the targets for the vulnerable for essentially end-of-life care. This is not about treating dementia. This is about identifying people who can be dementiated. And have a look at this. This is the at-risk patients aged 60 or over with cardiovascular disease, stroke, peripheral vascular disease, patients who are over 60, been smoking. If you've been smoking or you've had some alcohol consumption or obesity, or you're at risk of dementia according to this. No evidence for that we've seen, but there we are. Patients who are over 60 with a COPD diagnosis, not sure what that is. Down syndrome. If you're Down syndrome, they are looking for you. Other patients aged 50 or over. What's the connection between learning difficulties, Mike, and dementia?
I'd need to see some information on that.
We
I
would,
think.
wouldn't
Yeah.
we? Okay, well, how does the system work? Well, this is how it works, because the NHS is going to pay GPs to diagnose dementia. The moment you make a diagnosis, the surgery gets an upfront payment of 37 pence. That's how much a life is worth, apparently, Mike, but I'm being cynical, of course. The real calculation is here, because the upfront 37p is only part of it, but they calculate the payment on the number of assessments, in this case 38. It depends on how many assessments are going to be carried out overall in 2015-16, and that's used as a fractional multiplier of the 21 million. So what they're saying is the average GP surgery, a small surgery, can pick up a cool £3,192 in the year by diagnosing dementia.
Fractional multiplier, did you say there?
I did, yes.
So they're bringing the banking system into the NHS then?
Well, absolutely. Everything about this policy is to do with money, Mike. There's no care, there's no humanity. And of course, we've got a new dementia envoy appointed. And David Cameron, with the help of this new envoy, David Mayhew, is going to solve dementia not only in the UK, but globally. So David Cameron, who's failed really to sort Britain out at all, apart from destroy it, he's going to help the World Dementia Programme.
With £60 million.
With £60 million, is it?
Yeah, because if you remember, we were suggesting they swap that with the BBC budget. Yeah.
Right, okay. So there we are, David. It seems that the government would brand us all mentally ill or with problems. 2 million people the government's going to target by 2050. And we know what they've already started is to steal property. And on that happy note, let's move back to Scotland and the situation of the state effectively stealing children, named persons. Just to help you here, we've got the photograph of the Supreme Court. We've got the report on no to named persons of the government's failure to get involved in a discussion. We've got some good news in that the petitions now climbed quite dramatically to 20,000 people. And even mainstream press have been reporting on that Supreme Court case. Over to you.
It has been a good week for the No to Name Person campaign, and it has been a very bad week for the Scottish Government and for those who wish to see the state run our families. The case went down to the Supreme Court, so the No to Name Person campaign has gone through the Scottish courts without any success, really, or with very marginal success. The Scottish courts being, it would seem, unwilling to take a stand against the Scottish Government and unwilling to see the clear problem surrounding the definition, for example, of well-being and how that's not defined but is being conflated with welfare, and the fact that the threshold for state intervention into family life has, as a result, been dramatically lowered. So we've had many things happening this week. We had, at the start of it, we had Maggie Mellon, again, was invited to a conference in Glasgow to discuss the idea of rights, and they wanted to look at the named person scheme and how this affects rights. And she was in a sort of debate format. And nobody from the Scottish Government was available to turn up to that debate. Isn't that a surprise? They had to get one of their bought and paid for charities to go along and represent their case, but no one from the government would actually go and defend this policy in that open forum in Glasgow. We then went down to the Supreme Court. Now, Supreme Court is televised, and I managed to catch some of it. I actually saw the Supreme Court judges reduced to laughter as they read through some of the Scottish Government's documentation on named person. Some of the documents that actually had featured on the show some months ago, Brian. We've looked at these, the easy language guide to named person, which talked about negotiations over television viewing and which colour a teenager would paint his bedroom as legitimate areas for governmental intervention and guidance to the family and help to the parents. So from what I've seen, I didn't manage to watch the whole of the proceedings from the court, but it seemed to go really quite well. The named person, the noted named person campaign had a very coherent case. The government barrister, Mr. Wolf, seemed to be poorly informed. He often had to go back the next day or later on with answers to the questions from the Supreme Court judges. He didn't really seem to know his case awfully well and seemed to be toiling to make it. One part that struck me was he said in mitigation of the government's case, of mitigation against the accusation that this was going to involve unacceptable intervention in family life, that we mustn't assume that these named persons will overreach. Now, that is an explicit or implicit admission that, in fact, there's nothing really to stop them overreaching.
Right.
And I think the government may be in some trouble here.
Well, certainly the news articles that you've produced tend to indicate this. We've got a pretty heavy article. I think this is the Mail legal bid to scrap the state snoopers. I
Yes.
think that's is presumably the Scottish Mail.
Yes. And the second one here, Alan Massey and the Scotsman. Just a couple of quick quotes from that you might enjoy. He says, appointing child guardians is just one more way the state is attempting to turn us all into our own big brothers, writes Alan Massey. He talks about how the planned economy is as dead as mutton, and no one is going to come up with a Soviet-style 5-year plan. Yet, if the state control of the economy has been discredited, the state has accordingly pulled back from its attempt to manage economic life. It has been advancing in other areas, extending its influence, invading the home, and interfering in family life. And he concludes, the appointment of a state-approved minder for every child is a repulsive idea, but it is only an extreme example of the extension of state power, a power which assumes rights over individuals and families that few of us would grant it of our own free will. It represents an attack on the autonomy of the family and therefore a curtailment of liberty. The implication of this new socialism is that we are all ultimately the property of the state, which has arrogated to itself the right to order our lives according to its precepts. The assumption may be presented to us as benevolent, but whatever the intention, the consequences are likely to be as nasty in practice as the subjection of individuals and families to the state is deplorable to anyone who values freedom. Beautifully put. Bravo to him. And the title of that article, obviously, Airstrip 1 refers to George Orwell's 1984.
David, just to show people how there's been a change in the media, and you've pointed this out. Herald Scotland had printed a letter here, which was basically the state fighting back. So they were accusing, particularly the Christian Institute, of red herrings and scaremongering over named persons. We had this little lot from the National. They've apparently been particularly pro-government and anti-common sense, and they've been promoting the Minister Eileen Campbell. It's all those nice, I saw the phrase right-wing Christian groups, I think that was in the National. And then they're saying that emotive, if it saves one child, it's worth it. But the Herald has stuck behind you, hasn't it? So they're saying it's no surprise that 11 government funding agencies should write in support of a government policy, the named person scheme, which will increase referrals to their services. It means make them more money. And we've got this one, Ian McWhirter, yes, so-called state guardians are at the very least a snooper's charter. So it's just very quickly, with a little bit of an eye on the time, it seems that the Herald has changed its tack, whereas the National is clearly a government spokesman.
Yes, the Herald was the only major paper supporting this legislation. They are they're certainly putting the contrary view and are much more supportive of the No to Name Person campaign now. So they seem to have got the message that this is totalitarianism and has to be opposed. The National have not yet got the message. The National are, those 3 articles were incidentally from one day in the National, so they were going big on trying to defend the name person scheme. We will look for the National being a failing newspaper in future if they're going to continue with this sort of editorial policy.
Okay, well, just a brief, very brief comment on this one, because there was some debate appeared on TV. Gentleman on the left from Barnardo's, I'm afraid I didn't know who the gentleman on the right was.
Yes, there's Martin, on the left is Martin Crew from Barnardo's, who is there again to represent the pro-government, pro-named person view. Right, Barnardo's obviously are financially to benefit from this system. And the gentleman on the right is Stuart Waiton from the No to Name Person campaign and the University of Abertay. It was the BBC obviously won't touch this. They had question time was from Dundee yesterday, and total number of questions on the name person scheme. And I know there were questions proposed. Total number of questions on the name person scheme on that programme, 0. So the BBC are trying to get away from this now. They've done several programmes in the past, Kay Adams, etc., that was a disaster for the Scottish Government. They've obviously been, I'd suggest, warned off. But STV decided to go there. It was a short piece, 5 or 10 minutes, but really quite good. Interesting how Stuart Waiton finished. He was asked, you know, the Supreme Court might endorse this policy or might strike it down. Will that be the end of the matter? And his answer was, I have no trust for law lords. I think it's up to parents to get rid of this nonsense. So,
well, that is an extremely interesting statement, David, because let's move on to what the state is really up to. And I wanted to give some publicity here to New Fathers for Justice, because over the last few days they've been protesting at a variety of locations, and their target has been Sir James Mumby, head of the Family Law Division. Here are 2 of the New Fathers for Justice men on top of the entrance to the Medical Society of London, where Sir James was giving a talk on the work of the Family Law Division. I get an uncomfortable feeling about a mix between family law and the Medical Society. But they also stopped Sir James Mumby in the street. They were very polite on this video clip, which you can see on the New Father for Justice website, and they asked him whether he would talk about the fact that fathers in particular were being denied contact to their children. But what was nice to see is that the new fathers there were also saying, well, of course, women are affected badly as well. The statistic they kept mentioning was 200 children taken every day, but Sir James Mumby just didn't want to speak. We did a bit of research which led us into this. Families Need Fathers, which is a charity, a big name. Bob Geldof is behind this one, but they have got the transcript of a talk given by Sir James Mumby back in 2014, and what he says is this: what I spotted constantly, I'm not a psychiatrist and not a psychologist, but my perception was that the parents, both parents, had been completely disempowered by the court process. So here we've got head of the Family Law Division admitting absolutely no justice within the family courts, and of course hence the protest by parents and general public saying it's time people paid attention to this situation. So the courts, family courts out of control, no justice, parents no power, and in Scotland we're really going to stamp another layer onto this.
Yes, indeed. And I would suggest if anyone wants to get an example of why families need fathers, if you look at the recent history of the black community in America, as reported on by such people as Walter Williams, the economist, that shows the black community thriving and making huge strides as it came out of slavery and Jim Crow and lynching and all of this. Right up to 1965 when the state decided to help. And as soon as the help started, the deterioration started. The black family has been destroyed. And and we have crime, we have single-parent families, we have the absence of fathers from the home, and we have a situation so bad that the size of that population has dropped by something like 10 million since the mid-60s.
Okay. Well, David, have we got time for 30 seconds on just the Mises?
Yeah.
We've got the Mises Institute that you like to give a mention to. They've also picked up on named parents and are describing it as a national panopticon.
Well, this is my article for the Mises Institute of Scotland. So if people are interested in what I've got to say about this, it looks at the issue and addresses the argument that if it saves just one child, it analyses where that argument comes from, and it identifies Bentham and the utilitarian philosophy of the 19th century as the core of it, and looks at what that means in terms of the total observation of society by the state, and looks at it also in architectural terms as he developed a building to allow just this total
Surveillance.
total surveillance to be undertaken. And this building was called the Panopticon. It was used in prisons, but he wanted to use it in workhouses and in hospitals and in all parts of society.
Nice man. I think you've mentioned him, Mike, haven't you, in a UK column article?
He was a pederast.
And he was a pederast.
That I did not know.
Well, there we are. An interesting combination. Well, we just end on this. I'm so grateful that I think as a gentleman sent it to me, somebody had been doing a little bit of research on BBC Media Action, the BBC's very own independent charity, and they'd gone looking to see about the money that had been put into BBC Media Action from the Gates Foundation. And here you are, including the astonishing sum of 27 million US dollars, which was pumped in 2010. I understand that this is to do with the BBC Media Action's work in India. Having spoken to them today, they're not very friendly on the phone. They weren't able to tell me what the $1.3 million was used for, which is under the heading of communication. But I found these figures absolutely astonishing. Remember that BBC Media Action, the independent charity, shares Office support and pensions with the BBC, but it is independent. And I just think to myself, how is it that we've got a media charity which is now helping the world conquer disease, and we're looking at family planning and mental health and communication and HIV. Really, the only thing we need in this country is the BBC, because they're looking after all of our health needs. Or have I missed something, David?
Isn't that fascinating? Yes, but the tax-exempt foundations are getting everywhere. Yeah. I think we need to watch them very carefully.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. Well, that brings us to the end of today's news. David, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to all our viewers and listeners who contribute and provide information. We couldn't do what we do without you. If you haven't taken out a subscription yet to the UK column, perhaps you consider doing that, or perhaps making a donation. And as I've mentioned a couple of times this week, we're shortly to ask for your help to upgrade camera equipment in particular, so that we can make full use of this new studio. This will enable us to do a variety of things, including bringing some panels on screen with your technical expertise, Mike. So watch out for that, but a big thank you from us to you, and for all your support. We'll be back same time on Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.